Right now, it's my pleasure to introduce our second keynote speaker for today, Paul Howard-Jones. Paul is Professor of Neuroscience and Education at the Graduate School of Education in Bristol, where he leads the MSc Education Pathway in Neuroscience and Education. And his recent research has focused on games-based learning, as I'm sure many of you will know. Prior to his research career, he was a secondary school teacher, then a trainer of teachers and an inspector of schools. He was a member of the UK's Royal Society 2011 Working Group on Neuroscience and Education, and authored one of the first textbooks in this area, introducing neuroeducational research. I also have a plug for his new book, which is A Brief History of Your Learning Brain, which will be published this year by Routledge.
Only $14.99.
I thought I'd get it in before he did. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, so my background is half in neuroscience and half in education, and there are many people here who know more about neuroscience than I do, and many people here who know more about education than I do. But nevertheless, I have the privilege and sometimes the awkwardness of being straddled across both areas. So what I'd like to do in the next half hour or so is briefly review some of the insights that I identified for the Educational Endowment Foundation prior to their research call a few years ago, when they were thinking about what insights are actually close to classroom application, how close are they? And that's really just to inform the discussions today, because I thought that would be a useful thing to do. That will be a real whistle-top tour of all the different ways in which neuroscience may in the near future impact on classroom practice. And then the second half, I really want to be a little bit more provocative and share with you some of the issues, I suppose, that have been preoccupying my thinking about this area recently. So, in the review that I undertook about 3 years ago, I was asking, and I've tried to update it since, how far are we from applying neuroscience in education? And I judged the strength of the evidence in terms of whether it was low, medium, and high. The high evidence means that we've actually got multiple classroom interventions to inform us. So that's possibly the strongest type of evidence we could have. Medium is when we've got good laboratory interventions that may not necessarily translate to the classroom. Low is when we don't even have that laboratory intervention evidence yet. I say laboratory intervention, that's probably not the right way of putting it, but where we've tried to look at something reasonably educational-like as a task in the laboratory setting to support the idea. Distance to application, because some of these ideas would take a lot of work or a lot of resourcing and preparation to implement them. So, ones where we're not even sure what the application would look like, I categorized as distant. Ones where you could actually put it into the classroom now, I categorized as near. So there's quite a few things in mathematics. This is a very active area in neuroscience and education ventures at the moment. We're coming to understand that we have innate, well, maybe innate's too strong a word, a very early developing sense of quantity which supports our formal mathematics understanding. So when we ask even adults to calculate something exactly, we see different regions. Oh, this hasn't got a thingy. we see regions marked in blue in the brain, which can be more involved with language areas, actually, because you're thinking through the processes that are involved. Whereas when we ask adults to calculate something approximately, they actually use very different areas, and particularly parietal regions there. So understanding those number systems are helpful in terms of us beginning to realize how early development of mathematics occurs and sometimes how it can go wrong. We're also understanding that fingers, the embodiment of mathematics, can occur through our use of fingers, and in fact our grasping regions of the brain and the regions of the brain we use for that approximate number sense are quite close together. And this has given rise to some interventions that have shown just being more aware of your fingers can be helpful in terms of developing your early ideas about maths and number. Anxiety, maths anxiety is a growing area. We now recognise that a large number of individuals are prevented from being able to apply what they know about mathematics because of their emotional response to it. So it's not that they don't actually have the maths knowledge and understanding. Sometimes it's actually their emotional response which is preventing them from expressing it and thinking things through. And we heard this morning as well about mental rotation skills. There are interventions that show how mental rotation skills can be improved, and they appear to be related, mental rotation skills appear to be related to mathematics achievement, science achievement, engineering achievement. So there's a sense in which, you know, this is one of those areas where possibly cognitive training might give rise to improvements in academic achievement. And in fact, there have been computer-based, technology-based interventions that have shown, for example, that children with and without a diagnosis of number difficulty or dyscalculia are helped by a game that encourages a better physical awareness of number quantity. In this game, children were being asked to land their spaceship on a number line rather than expressing their answer to a maths question using symbols. And that is thought to improve that sense of quantity as a physical thing, and it was shown to improve their number ability. But interestingly, we see not just it helping the children with the diagnosis of dyscalculia, but also children without that diagnosis. And we also see a remediation of brain function associated in both those cases with number difficulty. So can training improve children's non-symbolic representation of number, their sense of it, and its relation to symbolic representation? How does this help their mathematics? Can video games improve STEM achievement? We heard a lot about video games this morning. Can understanding of maths anxiety improve maths achievement? Well, at the moment we have mixed results for training non-symbolic representations of number, some impact of training on symbolic representation and transfer to other numeracy skills. But I actually rated that as a sort of a medium strength in terms of the evidence. I think I might actually rate it a little bit lower, I think, in the last couple of years, because there's a general shift towards thinking that things are a little bit more complex than we originally thought. Finger gnosis training has been shown to improve some aspects of early number development. That's something that we could put into action straight away. That's a nice, that's a nice insight that's coming through. We haven't seen any attempt, as far as I know, so please tell me if I'm wrong, to show that playing video games can improve educational attainment at the moment. Although myself, I am very interested in that area, as are many other scientists, and we are, there are steps being made, there are attempts to try to show that that can be possible. Some of us are trying to understand the mechanisms, some of us are sort of building educational software based on action video games and testing it. In terms of maths anxiety, we have at least got one study that shows some treatment for maths anxiety can improve, and the treatment was really just discussing your fears, not even discussing what you're going to do about them, but just writing down your fears appears to improve maths achievement amongst maths anxious pupils in a subsequent test. So there's some possibilities there. Another very active and complex area where neuroscience is involved is our understanding of reading. We understand that different regions of the brain are involved with the ways in which, different ways in which we code language phonetically, in terms of the movements that we need to speak language, in terms of the sounds, in terms of the visual representation, and that these regions are highly interconnected. And it's given us, and in particular, I'll keep flicking this. In particular, we're interested in the visual word form area because in an intervention using computer-based software, it was shown that that area, as children learn to read, becomes more and more active and sensitive to print. And the visual word form area, though we call it the visual word form area, actually it's not that we're born within a region of the brain which is dedicated to reading, because of course we didn't evolve to read. This region of the brain actually is if we didn't learn to read, would actually be getting used to identify and recognize all sorts of different shapes. But as we learn to read, the brain becomes quite radically rewired, and that particular part of the brain becomes much more dedicated to print sensitivity. And that dedication to print sensitivity and recognizing shapes seems to be really important in those early stages of reading. So those sorts of insights, as well as giving us a neural marker for possibly, developing software that's more effective, it's also given some insight into the importance of that mapping between sound and visual form of language. Of course, I'm only really talking about one component of reading there, though, and another way in which neuroscience may help will be to identify where different individuals vary in terms of the difficulties that they have, in terms of the individual functions that are required for effective reading. So it's possible that neuroscience techniques, or at least neuroscience insights, may help towards an approach whereby we can identify individual needs and develop interventions for those needs, which are tailored to those needs, if you like. So at the moment, there certainly is a sense in which neuroscience has contributed to some of the interventions, the successful interventions that have taken place for reading. Exercise is a very under-accessed set of insights, I would say. Mostly exercise tends to be emphasized in schools as a way of maintaining physical fitness or team building, esprit de corps. But actually, exercise enhances executive function, and executive function is so important for learning. A lot of these cognitive training regimes that people are interested in are about developing that set of functions that allow us to focus and to learn. Exercise is one of the few things we know that really does do it, actually, and it's free and it's cheap, and you don't need to buy a manual to know how to do it. And you don't need to upgrade either, as you do with software. But actually, exercise is very underutilized. In this one study, they showed, for example, that compared to listening to an audiobook, teenagers who were just doing 30 minutes of exercise a day had much better attention skills. What they didn't show was that it necessarily transferred to academic achievement. But of the many, many interventions that have taken place, half of them have shown no effect, and we're talking about over 150 interventions. Half of them have shown no effect, and half of them have shown a positive effect. Now, in scientific terms, that's very strong evidence to show that exercise has a potential to raise academic achievement. So this is, very much an underutilized area, and I think one of the pieces of advice that the researchers are providing is that since we have so many that don't work and so many that do work, we need to understand more about how exercise, what sort of exercise can best, and how it should be implemented in the classroom. So what sort of exercise, or not necessarily in the classroom, but during the school day, we need to know more about how exercise can support academic achievement in order to design the best interventions, the best exercise regimes. But to my mind, it's one of the most hopeful areas. And this is one of the areas actually that is being funded as part of one of these EEF Wellcome Trust interventions. Teenage lifestyle. I've got a few teenagers, so I know a little bit about this. Sleep becomes disrupted for biological reasons because we know during adolescence that there is a shift in the circadian rhythms that help us go to sleep and wake up in the morning. But of course, there are many social aspects to disrupting teenage sleep as well, because it's a time when you get given more responsibility, your friends become more important to you. And the two other elements that contribute to it, we know, are technology, staying up late watching video games, or bright screens, texting under the duvet, or whatever, and also caffeine. So, these are two areas where we can understand the impact in terms of sleep. I won't go into the studies, but I won't go into that one. But I will say that we've shown that later starts, these are studies in America, have shown that a later start to the school day for teenagers can improve alertness. It can reduce absence. It can decrease sleepiness. It hasn't yet been shown that it can improve academic achievement, but again, this is another study that is taking place, funded by the Wellcome Trust and the EEF, to have a look to see if that can happen. Simply providing teenagers with information about sleep, which is one of the approaches I think this study has taken, has been shown really to just educate teenagers about sleep. They become very educated. They know everything then. They can tell you everything about how all the things that they're doing can disrupt their sleep and interfere with their academic achievement. But unfortunately, they don't seem to actually do anything about it. So, you know, there is a need to move towards a more of a changing culture, and there is some tentative evidence to show that changing the teenage culture, which is a very difficult thing to do, but can actually have a more positive impact on their sleep habits. I won't go into genetics, but embodied cognition is an interesting one. We've known about the enactment effect for some time. So if you do something, you're more likely to remember it and understand it than if you are just reading about it. But interestingly, it's also true if you're watching somebody do something. So if I'm trying to teach you a foreign language, and I'm telling you about certain words for actions, if I actually mime the actions in front of you, you're more likely to remember and understand the meaning of those words later on. How does that really work? Well, possibly through the mirror neuron system, because we know that when you observe somebody else performing an action, your brain responds partly in a way as if you are actually performing that action yourself. So understanding the way in which the brain operates like that allows us to gain insights into the enactment effect and associated effects as well. So this is an interesting area that may provide some insight. And in fact, you know, those sorts of insights could be applied straight away, which is why I've given it a distance of near to moderate. Spaced learning is an idea that has been around, thanks to psychology, since Ebbinghaus. For well over 100 years, we've known that students, individuals, will learn more effectively if you break up the learning into short bouts rather than giving all the information in one session. What we don't understand quite so much is exactly why that is the case, and neuroscience is beginning to offer a few insights in that area, although actually there are multiple explanations at the moment. But again, understanding how something works may help us promote it perhaps as a teaching practice, give us more confidence in it, but it can also inform how we implement it more effectively, perhaps. So again, this has also formed the basis of another intervention that's being backed by the Wellcome Trust and the EEF. And testing for learning. Again, we've known for some time that testing is very effective, but as a means to learn, you're more likely to remember and to understand concepts if you're regularly tested on them. But we have now a set of candidate explanations that are being explored. And if we understand more about the mechanisms and the processes, then perhaps we can produce means of testing which are more effective in terms of their potential for students to learn from that testing. One possibility is the role of reward, because it has been unclear what the relationship is between offering rewards in the classroom, offering incentives, and the learning that is achieved. There is no simple relationship between those as far as we can see, but there is possibly a simple relationship between the way in which the brain responds to rewards and the learning that's achieved. It appears to be a little bit more straightforward, that you can see there's a linear function emerging between the way in which the nucleus accumbens, which is a very important area for the uptake of dopamine when you're anticipating a reward, and the memory for what's going on at the time. So if we can potentially understand how the brain responds to reward, that may give us a basis for reward schedules that enhance learning. And again, this is forming the basis of an EEF Wellcome Trust funded project, which is one that I'm heading up, because we know that one way in which you can enhance that response is to offer uncertain rewards. So instead of saying you can have a point if you get this correct, I say to you, if you get this correct, you can have 2 points or no points at all, depending on the spin of a wheel of fortune. essentially. Now, you might call this gambling. I prefer to call it gaming, so I don't get into trouble with the sun or anyone. But it has been demonstrated by other researchers based on this idea that uncertain reward can enhance motivation and it can enhance learning in the laboratory studies. So now we're trying to do that in schools, and we're teaching Year 8 science for a whole year, involving questions for which one group are receiving uncertain rewards and another group are just receiving rewards. And when I say rewards, they're not material rewards, they're just points. There's nothing offered if you get the most points. Because something else that we know, incidentally, is that the way in which the brain responds is relative to context. So if you think you might be about to win £1 in a card game, actually you're going to be, and £1 is the most that you can ever win in that card game, you're going to be receiving just as much of a response in terms of your brain as if you thought you were going to win 1 penny, and 1 penny was the most that you could actually win in that card game. So on that basis, we don't need to offer any material reward at all, just points are good enough, and of course it is competitive. So if you're interested in that project, there is more about it there, but I can see that a leaflet's been handed out. Sadly, we can't recruit any more schools at the moment. We're actually underway with the intervention, and if you did want to get your school involved, I can only say I'm really sorry, because we could have done with a few more schools. Never mind. But if you want to know more about it, it's there, and the resources that we're using will be freely available to schools once the intervention is complete, which should be beginning of next year. Neurofeedback is a more radical way in which neuroscience may be helping education. My colleague Roy Cohen-Kadosh in his lab has been passing very, very small voltages across the scalp of young learners. And this, we're still not entirely sure why this works. One theory is that it influences the threshold at which neurons fire. I can just hear Roy saying, no, it's not really quite like that, but that's an overly simplistic explanation, I think. But what we do know is that it does appear to improve, depending on where you put the electrodes, with the small amount of electricity, it does appear to improve the processing power of the brain. And this was, I think it was first demonstrated in a really powerful way a few years ago when they had military staff who were going into Iraq, and they were training them in terms of identifying potential terrorist threats when they're walking down the street. And so it's like a virtual environment where you have to sort of spot the threat. And they found that when they passed these small electric currents across the head of their military staff, they were actually learning at about twice the rate. So it's definitely something which is worth exploring. But whether we're going to all end up with all our children in the classroom with a little electrical currents going over their head, I don't know. But already I should say that there are commercial devices that are being sold. It's particularly popular amongst video gamers, of course, because they think they can get a little bit of extra advantage by wearing this little thing. Oh, and I should also say a more serious application of neurofeedback, which doesn't require any electric currents, is just simply to be monitoring the way in which your brain is responding. And that can allow you to train yourself to enter particular mental states. And that was demonstrated at the Royal College of Music, which is the black and white photographs at the top. They're not video gamers. And those students managed to improve, on average, their final degree classification for musical performance by a whole grade as a result of doing this neurofeedback, which helped them enter this mental state where they were more creative in their performances. And that actually is also now being repeated for schools as well. So a similar study is now taking place in schools of that effect. Okay, so, and there are many other areas that I can't mention, but obviously, you know, areas like ADHD, many children are already receiving pharmacological interventions based on neuroscience, we hope. Memory and stress is another, it's a complex area where we're having to untangle. Sometimes stress can actually be good for learning, sometimes it can be bad. It's a complicated relationship, and I believe that as we're unraveling how the brain responds to stress, we're beginning to get a better idea of how we might predict when a mild amount of stress actually might be quite good. I mean, to give you an example of that, if you are mildly stressed about your exam and you are sitting in your room revising for it, that can help you, because the processes involved with the, both in terms of where the processes are taking place inside the brain in time and space, they're quite close together, and also externally in your environment, the learning and the stress is quite close together in time and space. On the other hand, if you're a little bit stressed when you go into the exam, that's not going to help you because the learning should have taken place by then. Or if you're sitting in your room and you're stressed because you're cold, or particularly hot, that's not going to help you because the type of stress that produces in the brain does not interact favorably with the type of encoding and storage required for you to remember your revision. So we're beginning to understand a little bit more about that. How learners visualize and imitate, I mentioned something about that in terms of observing somebody else moving in a teacher giving a language lesson. Working memory training, that's an area which I think has already been mentioned. Working memory is potentially a bottleneck for learning, so if we can expand it, then there could be wonderful things possible in terms of children's and adults' capacity to learn. And understanding adolescence. I mentioned sleep, but it's also a time of risk-taking, for example. And we're beginning to understand a little bit more about why teenagers take risks in terms of an underdeveloped frontal lobes for regulating your behavior, but a mature reward system that responds quite strongly, and perhaps more strongly than adults or younger children, to risk in decision-based tasks. Okay, so that was my very speedy overview of lots of different areas, which I hope will give some food for discussion when you're thinking about how neuroscience might help in the classroom. I'm just looking at this for the time, so I'm not checking my text. What I wanted to do now is just become a little bit more controversial and I'll ask you two questions. Well, to share with you two questions that I've been asking myself lately. Is the current model of how neuroscience should enter the classroom likely to be effective? Is this what we should be doing in terms of trying to get neuroscience into the classroom? Are neuroscience education efforts currently focused on the most pressing issues in education? And with my education hat on, these are the things which more and more have been worrying me. When I say current model, the model that appears to be coming about involves randomized controlled trials to test some of our ideas. The idea being that once we've established some scientific knowledge that might be of help to schools, we develop practices, resources, interventions with the help of teachers. We work out how they can be evaluated against educationally meaningful criteria, and that's often, things like SATs or GCSE grades or such things. And we do that using RCTs, and then we amend our resources, approaches, practices, that's the idea anyway, in the light of what comes out of the RCT. And then, at that point, which can obviously, there's a bit of a loop in there, we can then recommend these things to teachers. And this comes about through the sort of thinking that is being portrayed in more detail in this document, Test, Learn, Adapt, Developing Public Policy with Randomized Controlled Trials. And certainly the randomized controlled trial approach is on the increase, as you can see from this graph. So in health, you can see the black line there in health, but you can also see a smaller line which is on the increase, which is social welfare, education, crime and justice. So it's sort of coming out of medicine into many other areas, and it's certainly coming into education now. And for those who don't know, an RCT is basically stands for a randomized controlled trial, and it involves taking a group or your participants, randomly allocating them to at least two groups, one of whom undertakes an intervention, one of whom does not, and then you compare at the end their learning. And in education, that would mean some sort of pre-test or post-test, usually. there seem to me to be some issues with this approach. Firstly, when is the science knowledge established? At what point do we say we know enough about this? Because it seems to me that science is actually constantly rolling on. It's constantly improving, it's constantly providing insights. I mean, I gave the example there of mathematics, early mathematics. I would say like 10 years ago, there was quite a strong feeling that these animal senses of number were heavily involved in our understanding of dyscalculia. That was probably a problem with that animal intuitive sense of number that gave rise to problems with number amongst some children. Now I think that's sort of going in the opposite direction, is my sense of things. So things change. So when can we say that science knowledge is established? We should be designing practices, resources, and interventions collectively, collaboratively, between teachers and scientists, but is that happening? I'm not sure. And then we have the randomized controlled trial approach, and I am increasingly worried about the credibility of these trials because of the practicalities involved with them, and because they leave out very often individual differences amongst students and individual differences amongst teachers, which I see as probably the most important thing, possibly more important than the intervention. And the idea that we are going to go through these RCTs and then come back and amend what we're doing, it seems to me that we're setting out an incredibly long and very expensive process. And then when we do finally find something that appears to work in a particular context, in as controlled a way as we possibly can, because we need to get as much possible control in order to be able to make these things work, and say scientifically that this is our effect, actually it's one particular application, one particular implementation. So that's very prescriptive, because if we're going to say, yes, if you do this, it's going to work, we are saying, yeah, absolutely, if you do exactly this, exactly what we have done, it's going to work. So it's actually only going to give rise to a very prescriptive approach. We asked trainee teachers about what they felt was important for prompting and informing change. And what they felt was important, and I don't know if this chimes with you, the things they felt most important were colleagues' reports of these are trainee teachers, so I'm not sure it's true for practice, for professional practicing teachers, but it was towards the end of their training. Colleagues' reports of their observations and experiences, personal observation of how engaged students were with their work, whether they were on task, for example, formative assessment of their students through sort of questioning in the class, peer observation, so that obviously could be their mentor or somebody else watching their class. They also felt end-of-year exams, GCSE results, the research that they conducted themselves, but what they didn't think was important were results of large-scale randomized controlled trials of interventions, which I think is interesting. That's why I sort of feel that in itself, the prescription of good practices may have limited impact. Teachers always need to adapt to practice. This makes the prescription of a practice that they should follow, I think, in principle, quite difficult, if not impossible. We already know, as well, a lot about what constitutes good practice, what I really mean by that is we can identify good practice when we see it. I'm not always sure that we know what comprises it, but we can identify it. And practices do not predict impact very well, and alone. So practices alone don't appear to predict impact. So even if we got everybody to do things which we thought were particularly effective, we might still then not have a great improvement in terms of student outcomes. And this was actually expressed quite well by Rob Coe a couple of years ago when he, based on an up-to-date analysis of practices, a study that involved an up-to-date analysis of practices, what we know about good practices amongst teachers, pointed out that if a teacher that you've never seen before comes into a classroom and teaches a class, and you have to make a prediction as to whether that class is going to improve its outcomes or its outcomes are going to go down, randomly you're going to be 50% correct. If you don't know anything about a teacher and you just toss a coin, you're going to be 50% correct most of the time. If you include everything that we know about what that teacher should be doing, that improves your ability to predict student outcomes, whether they're going to go up or down to 60%, which I don't feel is actually very impressive. And I think what that's telling us is that recommending known practices may not in themselves have great impact. There are other aspects of what the teacher is doing that appear to be more important, other unrecognised aspects. So we already know a lot about what, sorry, I've put this in the wrong order, but one of the points I wanted to make was, do we scientifically understand what is good practice? Do we scientifically understand what we know already, what we can recognise already as good practice in the classroom? And are we able to communicate that very well? That appears to me to be an important, honest question to ask. So the other question that worries me is, are neuroscience education efforts currently focused on the most pressing issues in education? Because any element, I used to be a design and technology teacher, by the way, so it might explain why I've pulled up this push-pull model of design. But most innovation comes about through these two forces. There's this push of new insight or new technologies, or something new arrives like fiber optics, and people think, well, what can we do with this? I don't know, we'll make lovely lamps, which is what we did in the 70s, and then we realized that actually it had some pretty good communication possibilities as well. But then there's also this pull, there's this demand that we can sense in terms of the needs that are already out there and we're very aware of. I mean, it's wonderful when those two things go together, but actually they don't always. So what is the educational demand? What are the things that education appears to be worried about? Well, I jotted these down from a slide when I was asked to go to the DFE on some sort of consultation exercise about the spending review a couple of years ago. So these are the sorts of things that the Department for Education worry about. So I guess in the broadest possible sense, these are the things that we all worry about. We have a long tailback of poorly educated young people. Poor children have worse educational outcomes in the UK at every stage of education. There's considerable variation in attainment by ethnicity, gender and geography. The percentage of pupils with SEN is declining, but high compared internationally. Choice of good local schools isn't a reality for most. Pupils in need of the best teaching are not always getting it. We don't get the most out of high performance, and vocational education is the poor relation. Which of these problems are likely to be changed by prescribing specific practices? I don't know. It's just something, maybe they can be, but I think it's a question we have to ask if these are the big questions, these are the big issues that are facing education. I quite like, well, I almost like these quotes, but you can see I've changed them. I do think that there is something to be said for the truth of this. What is the most important school-related factor in student learning? Because I should also say, in the meeting, when I was present, and I jotted these down off the slide, we talked about all sorts of interventions, things that we could do, because those are things that you can prescribe, and those are things that you can be seen to be doing as policymakers quite easily. Oh, well, we know this new neuroscience education intervention appears to work, so everybody should be doing it now, or at least we'll put it on our website and say it's got and suggest it. But actually, it was agreed by everybody that the most important factor was teaching and how to improve teaching. That was the most important factor. If there was a way of doing that, then everything else would be okay. But we can't do that, so let's forget about that and talk about interventions. That was the way the discussion went. And I think, we have to, in a way, tackle this issue. What is the most important school-related factor in student learning? The answer is, according to Schwartz, teachers, but I'm not very sure about that. I think that kind of sounds like we're blaming teachers, and I don't think we're blaming teachers at all. But I do think the answer is teaching. I think, if anything, if I'm pointing fingers, I'm really pointing the fingers at the scientists, and I hope you understand that by the time I get to the end of this. No education system can be better than the quality of its, again, this is Andreas Schleicher at the OECD, teachers, he said, but I want to say teaching. Teaching is complex. We know a little bit about learning, I would say now. We do know a bit about learning. I think we hardly know anything at all scientifically about teaching. And I don't think we can avoid, I don't feel we should be trying to avoid this. Experts on effective teaching emphasize the importance of a teacher's assumptions and beliefs about the learner's mental world of ideas and how teaching and learning influences that world. So what I've tried to do there is to provide support for the idea that understanding learning is really, really important to teachers. They use that understanding every single day and it underpins their practice. It may not be formal, but that's at the core of their decision-making process, those decisions that influence learners' outcomes. So my two questions were, is the current model of how neuroscience should enter the classroom likely to be effective? Are neuroscience education efforts focused on the most pressing issues in education? I would say to the first question, possibly not. It's possibly not the best model if it seeks merely to identify practices and ignores the teacher, and maybe I should say and students at the end of that as well. Are neuroscience education efforts focused on the most pressing issues in education? Possibly not, if these efforts ignore the importance of the teacher's understanding of learning. And this is really, I suppose, what the central question is, can science do a better job of providing teachers with accessible and meaningful concepts, the ones they need to understand their own everyday practices? Because I think that's possibly the most important issue that's facing education. Not necessarily some fancy new intervention, but actually everyday practices. So from an educational perspective, a priority for educational neuroscience may be to develop those concepts and learn how to communicate them. And it may be that that's more important and meaningful than a test, refine, and adapt cycle that results in identifying specific prescriptive practices, even if it does succeed in doing so. Okay, so a bit of an opinion piece, and I'm not expecting everybody to agree with me, but I hope that it's been helpful for some food for thought, perhaps.